Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Manuel Eisner. I'm the director of the Institute of Criminology. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here at this public seminar of the Institute of Criminology. We have Dr. Alex Sutherland here as our guest speaker, with Barak Ariel as a discussant on whether nudges can prevent crime and improve criminal justice. In addition to the audience here in the room, we have about, I don't know exactly how many, about 30, 50 people who attend the seminar online. And so we're running this as a hybrid seminar. We tried the model for the discussions last week and it worked quite well. The way this works is that, the way this works is that people here in the audience are not given the opportunity to ask questions directly, because we don't want people to give another talk. We would like to engage in the conversation. And so what we do is that we've opened a page on Slido. So you can type in Slido and you're being taken to that page. On that page, you type in this number that is given here. Now, one of the things that you need to do, unless you either log into Slido now, or you write down the number, because you won't see the number as the talk continues. For up to 160 characters, not words, characters. For academics, this is difficult, but that's the rule. 160 characters, and then you can like questions that have been asked by others. So if you see the questions, we read through the questions, you think this is an important question that I would like to see discussed, please like the questions, and that gives me, I'm going to do the moderation of the discussion afterwards, that gives me the possibility to ask the speakers the questions that are most relevant to this audience. And the same will be done by those of us who join online. So these lives and the questions will be merged between those who are physically here and those who are participating online. That's all from me. I'm happy to hand over now to Barak, who will introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief because I want to hear you, not me. Alex Sutherland is a good friend of ours, of the Institute and ours personally. He's the chief scientist and director of research and evaluation with the Behavioral Insights team. He publishes a lot. He publishes in body cameras, in policing, in health, economics, and many other fields. I won't go into the entire list. He worked on RAND for quite some time, did a lot of research there as well. He also taught on the SSRMC, some of you are familiar with that program. Did one also quite well. He's been to Oxford before. He joined Cambridge University, which is something to note. And he's going to talk about nudges and how that can potentially be helpful in the world of criminology. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Switch my slides. Let's see if it works. Did that work? There we go. Okay, great. If you hear a loud beeping, it's my watch going off to remind me to stop talking. So I will stop at about 45 minutes or so. Is that okay? Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be here and to talk to you about behavioral science and nudges. I'm going, well, as Barak's already introduced, I'll just get straight on into it. I will start with a confession. And the confession is that what I've got you here to think about nudges, talk is about more than nudges. And you hopefully understand why. And my central argument really is that behavioral science has a lot to offer. Criminology, crime prevention, and criminal justice. And there goes the second part of this is that we should embrace it. I'll give you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about in the session. So just so you know where you are. And you'll see that I start off talking a little bit about behavioral insights and behavioral science before diving into some examples from crime and justice. And the idea is not to give you, a sweeping course of the entire field, because that would be a book or several books, probably more than likely. but also to talk about the fact that it's not just about nudges. And I think that's one thing to really keep in mind, is that this work is often characterized as being about nudges, but it is actually more. Okay. A little bit about Behavioral Insights team and about behavioral insights and behavioral science. So, as I said, there's a quiet revolution in behavioral science and policy now. You may have heard of the Behavioral Insights team. It started life in 2010 inside the Cabinet Office in UK government, and it was 4 people. It's now a global organisation, about 250 people. And part of what it has been part of is getting the ideas of behavioural science and behavioural insights into public policy. And as of 2022, there were 202 behavioural insights units around the world, doing a mix of different things. But I think in any sector, that would be considered kind of remarkable growth. And that just speaks, I think, to the kind of influence and importance of this work is being placed in this work. And there's a real mix of kind of what those units might focus on, but I think it's just worth noting that this is happening around us. And you may not know that the UK is a leader in the field of behavioural science, and particularly the translation and application of behavioural science into policy. UK policy and business community have become heavy users of behavioural research with widespread demand for more. And the figure on the slide is the very picture of Patrick Vallance, Chief Scientist for Government, presenting a meta-analysis of UK government's areas of research interest. Behavioural science was the greatest area of need identified in those areas of research interest. Alongside the behavioural science kind of quiet revolution, there is another one happening. Many of you won't know or won't have heard of in the UK government, the Evaluation Task Force. And this is a joint Cabinet Office Treasury initiative who are pushing departments to be more empirical and be, in particular, more experimental. And they have substantial success basically in the run-up to the last spending review, and since then trying to make government departments more empirical and to test out and have plans in place for testing out policies. Just as an aside, so the National Audit Office published a report at the end of last year that showed only 8% of government spend on major projects, which is 35 billion of 432 billion, had robust valuation plans in place since 2019. That's thinking from 108 major projects, 9 of them, it was 9, had any sort of evaluation that was robust in a sort of meaningful way. So it's like 400 billion pounds of expenditure. So that's also happening alongside the behavioural stuff as well. So what is behavioural insights and behavioural science, and why is it useful? I guess we might start with why do we need it? And a core problem in policymaking is that when governments in particular want to change citizens' behaviour, your behaviour, they tend to rely on 3 main tools. Laws and regulations, noting that I don't think gavels are actually used in English and Welsh courts ever. So apologies to anyone who's in the courts. Incentives and information. Underpinning all 3 of these is a working model of humans as rational actors. If we create a regulation, people will follow it. If we design an incentive, people will want it. And if we give people information, they'll act in line with it. But that isn't the case all the time. And we need a more realistic model of human behaviour. So, as I said, a lot of policy making is kind of premised on a simple rational actor model of behaviour, but it's not really supported by the research that many of you will be familiar with. Most famous, I think, of the work that's trying to advance this or dispel this idea is that by Kahneman and Tversky and Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which how many of you have in the room have read that book? Okay, let me try again. How many of you started reading it and actually finished it? Okay. Some data showing that only about 7% of people actually finished the book. Knowing that information, I purposely sat and read the whole damn thing. And for those of you who don't know, Piketty's book on capitalism, only about 3% actually finish it. So Kahneman's work, and it should be said that of many others, illustrate that human decision-making behaviour do not follow a strict rational actor model. What they argue and show is that humans operate a dual system of decision-making. And I've got the kind of up on the slide already. So the first on the left is fast and retrieval. It's automatic, we're better thinking about it. So if I ask you what 2 times 2 is, you don't need to answer. You just know, it's just there. You don't have to think about it. The second is slower and more reflective. Are you okay?
Yes, there was just somebody commenting that
They couldn't hear.
the microphone is not properly tuned. I don't know whether maybe
Yeah, okay, hang on. I'll just draw it here. Now it's more like an announcer in the supermarket. Aisle 1, clean up. Career. So yeah, so the second system is slow. So it's slower and more reflective. And we use this for more complex or novel problems that require effort. So if I ask you what's 24 times 17, you might have felt yourself stop and think, maybe even frown. And if you were doing something else, you might have even stopped doing it to concentrate on the task at hand. This is just a nice illustration, a neat illustration of the two systems at work. And both really are important to get into life effectively and efficiently. And we're increasingly learning that system one thinking can sometimes lead us astray in different ways, and we have a limited capacity for system two thinking. And the idea of this kind of two modes of thinking, decision making, and behaviour should also be familiar to you, those at Cambridge. If you're familiar with work of Theo Wikström on situational action theory, a big part of that is kind of setting out that actually there are two modes of behaviour, habitual and more deliberative. So there's a kind of parallel here, which I found quite reassuring. I think it was quite nice to kind of see this coming from a completely different field and seeing this kind of parallel being discussed. So if we accept that human behaviour isn't purely rational and deliberative, then what policies we design, how we communicate them, will be quite different from those designed on the basis of a rational action model. What was the math answer? Did anyone have it? 408. Not because I'm good at math, I've done that a few times before. So let's spend a few moments just talking through the consequences of system one thinking and how it affects us in the day-to-day. So, do we have unlimited willpower? Probably not. We all start maybe the new year with resolutions about diet, exercise, reading books, or whatever it might be, and then life happens and we get to the 2nd of January eating a nice slab of chocolate cake and we should. Interestingly, we can actually use these opportunities, these kind of reset points or fresh start points as an angle. One of my favorite bits of work that BIT have ever done was sending people with convictions, basically birthday cards or New Year's cards saying, hey, new year, new you, sort of thing. Wasn't effective, didn't do anything, but they tried. And the idea was it was innovative. It was really nice. It was a really neat work. Do we also have unlimited cognitive resources as like kind of really extreme versions of like rational actors as opposed to? Definitely not. So an example from the literature, one of the leading causes of death of firefighters in the US was what? Anyone want to guess? Smoking? 1984, between 1984 and 2000, not wearing a seatbelt. Not wearing a seatbelt. So it counted for about a fifth to a quarter of all fatalities of firefighters. And about 80% of those basically just hadn't put the seatbelt on. Now the firefighters know the statistics, they get taught this in safety training. The issue is that they forget to put their seatbelt on because they're so focused at the point of being out on the call, on the task at hand, which is preparing to go and do a rescue or go and fight a fire. And they basically block out all other tasks. And this illustrates nicely that, well, nicely, we have kind of limited resources, and actually what's going on around us can really be a drain on our ability to kind of think rationally, deliberatively, and to focus on specific tasks if under lots of pressure in particular. Those of you who've got small children will remember what it was like to have small children might nod along with that idea. Sometimes you just can't think about what you need to do next because you have lots of small people demanding your attention and it can be quite hard to concentrate. Okay, let's illustrate again this point about our context. So the two colors, the two squares on the slide, are they the same color? Obviously not. They're obviously different. I can see it myself. I can see it on the screen here. They're obviously different colors, except they're not. So what this is illustrating is that in this case, your perception was colored, literally colored in this case, by the context. So your judgment was influenced by the context. Broadening this point out, we know that our environment affects our choices, often in quite profound ways. Again, not news to anyone who thinks about, say, environmental criminology, and our memory, decision-making, and so forth, are also affected by our environment. So we need to pay attention to those. We also know that the person and their environment interact. So if people are stressed, under time pressure, or facing lots and lots of choices, or other kinds of kind of mental scarcity, their decisions are affected in predictable ways. So what behavioral scientists are trying to do is take that knowledge and apply it to real world situations. Okay, and one final kind of point, really important point from behavioral science in relation to behavior change. In terms of actions and behavior, the intention-action gap is a key barrier. And this slide again kind of sums it up nicely. I don't have any fancy studies to talk to you about this, but if you've ever had a good intention and not followed through with it, then you'll know what I'm talking about. If any of you out there are actually able to always follow through on your good intentions, please tell the rest of us how you do it. In fact, maybe you don't want to, you'll be a millionaire or, within a few years. But the point here is that basically, this in particular, I think, is relevant to those working on the front line, say with offenders who are trying to change behaviour. Police, probation, or prisons, like this intention-action gap is potentially one of the big things that isn't discussed much, but could be one of those things that is a lever for kind of behavioural science to help. So to summarise, humans are not robots. Funny enough, we have limited self-control, we're forgetful, we make decisions based on what's easiest or because of what others are doing, and sometimes we're motivated more by money, by emotions than by money, and that just makes us all human. Now, if you were to get excited and start looking into this literature, which I did initially when I joined BIT, you'll find there are many lists of heuristics and biases. The Wikipedia page is hundreds of the damn things. This can be overwhelming. Now, BIT, others have done the same thing. Have tried to kind of boil down this to make it so easy to think about and to work with. And this is the EAST framework, as it's called, that BIT produced in 2014 and again 2015. So easy, attractive, social, and timely. Easy, make it low or no effort if you're interested in trying to change behavior. Use defaults, reduce hassle, simple and clear messages, and always a clear call to action. What do people actually need to do? That's one of the key things. Make it attractive, so make things look appealing and engaging. Use colors, images, human design incentives so that people they kind of maximize effect. Social, use social norms. Networks, emphasize relationships and reciprocity. Timely, when we are prompted, matters. And what are the immediate cost benefits of people, and help people with planning. And Richard Thaler's kind of one-line takeaway for this: if you want people to change their behaviour, make it easy. And that's kind of the main thing, really, trying to make it easy. And I should say, it's not just a case of reading off a menu of biases and then applying them. You have to really understand the problem first. You have to understand and start with the problem first. What's the problem we're trying to solve? What do we know about it? What's the evidence for that? And your hypothesis about why the problem occurs in a particular way. And I think you can bring this together with this quote from a book from two colleagues of mine wrote on behavioural insights. The behavioural insights approach uses evidence of the conscious and non-conscious drivers of human behaviour to address practical issues. I like this because it allows for application to pretty much anything. Not just about decision making, but any practical issue. We think behaviour is a part of it. And if you look at the breadth of the work that BI teams and units do, it covers kind of the entire range of public policy. From climate change to corporate regulation to financial behaviour to crime and so forth. So let's just try and illustrate some of this in practice. Did any of you receive a text message? Those who got vaccinated in the UK, did you get a text message about vaccination? Hands up if you did. Okay, a few of you might have got a message that looked like this or quite similar to it. What I want you to do is spend a moment reading the message and thinking about it, and then just shout out and describe what you see in there, with apologies to those online. So have a look through the message. What can you see in the message?
Link.
A link? What is it? What's that going to help with? Yeah. Anybody else? Observations? Yeah.
See three words at the top: priority and free.
Yeah. Yeah. So in this simple text message, there are about 8 different things at work, 8 different elements at work. And this isn't BIT, this is somebody else who got the message and then posted this kind of summary of it online. There were 6 they observed. I'll add in a couple more because I think they're also in play. So I won't go through all of them, but like the idea of Brits love being in queues. We love being first in the queue as well. So you reach the top of the queue and you're priority. Oh, now I feel really special. And you're getting a free vaccine, yeah, not just any of them, free. You can book it now, and then you've got a way of doing it, which makes it really easy. Just click the link or dial this number, and you can go ahead and do it. Yeah, so packed into this tiny little SMS is like a lot of thinking and behavioral stuff, and that's kind of the point. Now, there are loads of different, I think we did 8 or 9 versions of these, and we did test this out in a field trial. That's being written at the moment. Results aren't public yet. But we had about 8 different versions to test out, and there was a process we went through to kind of get to those 8 down to 11. And it's one of those kind of amazing pieces of work that you see happening around you. I wasn't really involved with it, but it was happening in real time during the pandemic. But I mentioned the SMS was from a trial, and while behavioral science and behavioral insights are spread and really popular and they're very widely used, it's actually a much smaller proportion, is my guess, my supposition, that are routinely testing ideas. So lots of people are interested in applying this stuff, but as far as I can tell, not as many are trying to test it out. And so what the IT and other units are trying to do this is combine both behavioral science with rigorous evaluation. And at BIT in particular, we tend to use, almost predominantly have used, randomized control trials. And we have done this for about a decade, more than a decade. Those of you who know about running experiments, you know they're not straightforward. So it really does take some effort to kind of convince people, both one, to use behavioral science, but also two, then to test out things and admit that things might not work. And that's kind of part of the job that BIT does and people do as well. And so really, the important point before I move on is the kind of the applications in climate justice is basically it's not about replacing the traditional levers of government, it's about augmentation. So you're trying to enhance and augment existing programs or thinking of ways of designing systems or policies that are informed by behavioral science, not necessarily replacing. Okay, so how is all this relevant to crime and justice? Hopefully you've borne with me for a minute. Okay. So this is a map of the justice system in the UK by the Institute of Government. Quick pop quiz. Where do you think the foregoing, the previous slides and discussion are relevant in this system? It's not a rhetorical question. What do you think? Nowhere. Brilliant. I'm going to go. No.
Can you rephrase it?
So where do you think like behavioral science, behavioral insights will be relevant in this system? Yeah, all of it. And not just the system itself, but the kind of organizations that help it to run. So I'm going to talk through some examples of the application in the system, and then come back to this slide as well and talk about it a bit more. So within justice system, my view, is just my opinion, is that kind of policing is probably the furthest ahead with kind of embracing and thinking about this and applying it in the field. Thanks in part to Barack and Larry and Heather as well. Kind of applying these ideas in the field and testing things out. And I'm going to talk through one main example and then kind of sidestep onto something else. I didn't really have time to go through loads of those examples as much as I would like to. So here's an example. This is a behavioral insights team trial, which was presented last week by Mast, where it was happening. So if you're caught speeding in the UK, you get 2 things: a notice of intended prosecution and a letter basically saying, or information leaflet about speeding and about driver awareness. And really, we don't tend to think about paperwork as a place where if we change paperwork, we can improve outcomes. And often we just carry on with paperwork in the same way it's always been done before. But what if we could kind of change paperwork and get better results? And that's what we're trying to look at here. So what we wanted to do is test out whether it's possible to improve the paperwork and see if that helps people respond to the letter on time and prevent them from driving too fast again in the future, to prevent speeding in the future. So on screen is the original document. The language is very formal and has lots of references to legislation in it, but doesn't really tell people clearly what to do. And so we redesigned the form, we made it much simpler. We told people what they need to do clearly, making a clear call to action. You have to go and do this thing. We remind them about the need for honesty, the driver declaration. I should add the caveat is that that hasn't replicated. And the signing at the top of the form has not replicated. It's been replicated by the original authors, and again, has since been kind of not debunked, but has been shown not to be as effective as originally thought. So we redesigned the information leaflet 2. I haven't got time to really show that on the screen here, but we basically ran then a trial that compared new form and new leaflet in various combinations compared to control. So we have effectively a 4-arm trial. So one is like old form, old leaflet, new form, old leaflet, old form, new leaflet, and then the bottom one is new form and new leaflet. What do you think happened? The skeptics, the experimental skeptics, Barack, I'm expecting you to kind of be no. Okay. So what we found actually is that there was a small but important measurable difference in terms of speeding, reoffending effectively at 6 and 12 months. So at 6 months, there was about a 1.1 percentage point difference between those who got both the new form and a new leaflet compared to controls, and that was maintained at 12 months. It didn't decay. It was still there. It was persistent. That was unusual in itself, which is great. And really, I mean, you might be skeptical. It's a 4-arm trial. There's lots of, the sample size is 51,000. So that's also unusual in experimental criminology. You don't tend to get studies as large as that. And so, we think this is a really important result because it illustrates that simple changes like this can have a real world impact that's measurable. And actually you could attach a value to it as well in terms of how much this has saved to the public purse. And I should say as well, if I was going to say to you, hey, you can probably reduce crime by 1 percentage point just by doing stuff that's already free, that costs you nothing to redo, I imagine you say yes, we should do that. But we can also learn a lot from things that backfire. And there's a recent study which I want to talk about very briefly, published in Science by 2 authors called Hall and Madsen. They report the result of a field experiment that used dynamic road signs to inform drivers about the number of fatalities. So as an example on the slide, the intervention backfired, increasing average speed and actually causing 4.5% more fatalities within 10 kilometers of the signs. Their explanation basically is the signs were too salient. They actually distracted drivers. What's sobering for me is to think through how many times those signs have been used around the world in different contexts with no evidence at all of effectiveness or otherwise. I know that they're used in Cambridge a lot, for example. While we're talking about backfires, I'd say also one of the most important papers in terms of demonstrable backfire was written by Barack. Not to do with speeding, but to do with tax. So he managed to demonstrate, against the kind of backdrop of quite a rose-tinted view, that if you did anything on tax, you'd improve the tax pay. That you could actually find a backfire if you tried to do kind of moralized messaging. So why I think it's important is because it probably prevented lots of other tests along those lines happening. So we can't evidence that. I don't know how much it cost the Israeli government, Barack, maybe you can't ever say, but but that to me is a really important thing. We've done something it doesn't, which is just as important as saying something does work. So, touch on one example in policing. We could be talking about other things, to the vehicle crimes, tactics for counter-terrorism interviews, primary prevention in burglary, recruitment into the police, cyber resilience, and so on. We can think in more general terms about situations in policing whenever decisions are made, whenever discretion is an option, and processes within organizations. Okay. So I'm going to move on. 2 examples from the courts. You may or may not know that the courts of England and Wales have sentencing guidelines. Anyone know why we have them? Criminology Institute. Pick up. Why do you have? Okay, take a wild guess. Why do you have sentencing guidelines? You think?
The standard deviation in sentencing is out of
There we go. That's a technical answer. So basically, you have lots of variation in sentencing without them, in the absence of them. And on the slide is an example of sentencing, the impact of sentencing guidelines. On the left-hand side, you see that the vertical line is the sentencing guideline being introduced. You see after that, the severity of sentencing increases immediately following the introduction of the guideline. The right-hand example from the same piece of work, before the guidelines introduced, Larry's point illustrated really nicely, you have a massive spread of sentencing for the same offence. Afterwards, you have really, really tight sentencing. Now, I know, and I've got to say, this is one of the few areas of justice where I am utterly convinced by non-experimental work. Like nothing else could possibly have this impact on these specific offences exactly at the same time on a national scale, other than the guideline. I know that if we were running experiments and getting these kinds of results all the time, we'd be over the moon. But this stuff happens all the time. We don't really kind of pay much attention at all. Some do, lots of legal scholars do, and some quantitative people who work in sentencing do as well. So I think this is, to me, this is, why I use this as an example of behavioural science in practice. We have this because we know that if we don't have it, there are lots of problems with sentencing. Lots of variation in sentencing that probably shouldn't be there, and the guidelines are there to help the decision maker, in this case the sentencers, work through how to give a sentence that's consistent. Okay, another example, this is from the US, this is from New York, reducing failure to appear in court. So kind of quick form redesign example, not done by BIT, and basically old and new versions of the form, the three things they did. Changing, so the old version of this, on the left-hand side, it says complaint information, the people of the state of New York versus, on the right-hand side, it says criminal court appearance ticket. Really, really clear what it's about. And there are other things within there that are changed. When you have to turn up and why, and the consequence of missing are just made much more salient. So again, quick redesign, and then they also added in text message reminders to get people to kind of come to court. And what's interesting, lots of results on the screen. I'm just going to talk about the main one, which is the best version of the new form and the most effective text message versus controls led to a 36% reduction in failures to appear in court. From a simple form redesign and a text message, again, which cost almost nothing. And they estimate that something like an estimate 20,000 warrants did not need to have to be issued as a result of that, with all the costs that come from that, all just from redesigning a form. And it's worth dwelling briefly on the right-hand side, the very right-hand side, the different kind of biases and elements of behavioural science that they were kind of driving these interventions. People had misperceptions about the need to attend court for a minor offence. People just thought they didn't need to, or thought it was unfair. People discounted the costs of not appearing in court for basically, well, it's an effort, I'm not going to bother doing it. And actually not thinking, if I don't go, the consequences are much, much greater. People also thought that you didn't have to, most people didn't attend court, which wasn't true. They had this kind of misperception in their mind. Actually, we don't have to go there. They did. And finally, this long gap. It was about 60 to 90 days between the ticket and the court date. So you could just forget that you had to go to court, unless you're kind of thinking, all right, I need to plan in my day for book a day off work, all that sort of stuff. Okay, I didn't have time to get into talk about prison and probation, but I want to give one example. A piece of work being done in London by a charity called Catch-22, working on preventing fixed-term recalls to prison for breaching what are called license conditions. You get released from prison, you have license conditions, and really trying to work with prisoners to help prevent recall to prison, because each fixed-term recall costs at least £1,300, and then lots more probably besides in terms of admin costs. And they're trying to provide what's called through the gate service for people leaving prison, support, rehabilitation advice, and really when you start thinking about how much business as usual costs, lots and lots of fixed term recalls to prison, you start thinking, well, maybe we should spend some money on preventing them. Yeah. And if you can quantify it and put a number on how much things cost, then it makes it much easier to have a conversation with some policymaker or decision maker. We need to do things different. I don't know if that is being tested. My guess is probably not. We need more evidence on those kind of things, but it's just as an example. And I'll finish up the examples with one from New Zealand. This is from the New Zealand Ministry of Justice, again, post-court, and not quite probation of prisons, but has relevance given it about fine collection. This is like the administration of justice stuff. And really, again, it's a simple intervention, a text to say, hey, Larry, your fine is due in 7 days. Pay to avoid this $102 in late fees, call the Ministry of Justice on this number, and click on the website. With a simple text reminder, they managed to have a 10 percentage point difference in total or partial fine payment. Again, almost costless intervention with real world impacts. It makes me wonder actually whether we mentioned the idea of the stuff from New York earlier, whether there's now enough evidence on this sort of kind of prompting by fine payment to start doing like reviews, systematic reviews. That's one thing for Peter and the Campbell Crime and Justice Group to think about. But it seems like there's a growing body of evidence out there. This simple stuff is effective and we should just be doing more of it. Okay. Getting there. So, just to summarize, I've given you a lot of information. So, crime and justice are driven by decision making, by whether it's offenders, police, prosecutors, courts, prison, probation. We know a lot about what affects decision making and what doesn't. I'll give the example of the Hungry Judges study, which I can get into if you want to. And justice is also very procedure and process driven, and that can be nudgy or sludgy. I haven't talked about sludges, sludge, and that's also a thing. They're kind of the opposite. But really, and this is I think the case for why I think behavioral science has relevance in crime and justice. A key challenge for just applying behavioral science in crime and justice is if we're looking at reoffending as an outcome, it's a statistical thing with apologies. It's regression to the mean. So basically, if you observe extreme value, you're likely to see that extreme value return to kind of a localized mean for that group or population over time. This is an empirical example from a project that I was involved in many, many years ago. This is the reoffending rates for persistent young offenders before and after an intervention took place. Now, if we didn't have the comparison group, we didn't have the orange line, we might think we've intervened, oh look, we've had amazing success because we've done something with this group and their offending's gone down. This to me is the key challenge in crime and justice, is that unless we have comparison groups, we're going to really run into this problem time and time again. This is like preaching to the choir. People in this room know this. But it really makes the point to me that this isn't just a nice to have, it's actually an essential part of doing this sort of work in crime and justice. Otherwise, we'll just get loads of false positives, shaky findings, and then overblown claims, which I see a lot of as well. So, nearly done. I want to just come back to this slide very quickly. So, I give an example from behavioral science within the system, and I think there's much more that could be done. But not only can you think about the decisions being made within the system as citizens move through it, but also about the operation of the system itself and the organization responsible for that system too. So how they operate, how they hire people, who they hire, what it's like for citizens who interact with those systems, and then how those departments or institutions communicate what they're doing to the public. We'd also be thinking about how we design our justice institutions and systems and the policies themselves with a behavioural lens. And you think, well, this has been done already. A colleague of mine, Ed Braden, recently wrote a blog post. There are thousands of opportunities within government. As a very kind of rough bucket and envelope calculation, there are thousands of opportunities for this stuff in government. We're only just starting to do this, so we should be quite bullish about the possibilities for the application in the system itself and in the institutions that run it. Okay. Point about it's more than about nudge. This is actually a nudge. You can't see it. It's quite disgusting, really. There's a fly in the middle of the urinal to help men aim better. And really want to kind of get past the idea that I've talked a lot about nudges so far, things that are quite small changes. But we can be thinking differently and just kind of incorporating elements of behavioral science into interventions that seem much more complicated. And we can go upstream. That isn't like a pun on the previous slide, but basically trying to, for example, trying to augment interventions with parents or young people or other institutions. And I want to give an example from the US, which is called Becoming a Man. Has anyone heard of this program? Possibly not. Okay, worth talking about in that case. So the question they're trying to answer is, how can we help youth avoid the kinds of automatic behavior that can be dangerous or deadly in some urban neighborhoods? They did 2 randomized experiments and found this intervention, Becoming a Man, cut violent crime arrests in half and boost the high school graduation rate by, it was 19%, I think. And what did they do, I guess is the question. How did they achieve this new miraculous result? It was a school-based program targeting young people, lots of risk factors for violence. That's pretty standard. That's how lots of interventions work. There were full-time counselors and mentors who worked on social and emotional skills. I think the key thing they were trying to do is they had group and individual sessions that emphasized emotion regulation, specifically switching from fast to slower thinking, hence the title of the paper, So take a beat, take a breath, think about it for a second, literally a second or two. And again, getting results like that from this sort of intervention is pretty impressive. And it's obviously building on a lot of work that exists on self-control, emotion regulation from different disciplines. But the success to me also points to potentially a theoretical gap. From the Campbell review, I think it was maybe 10 years ago, which may have been updated, I haven't looked at this literature since, there was a suggestion that self-control may not be malleable beyond the age of 10. These kids were older than that, so there's clearly something that's changed as a result of this intervention. So is there something we're missing, mismeasuring? I don't know with the criminology, that's, I guess, for discussion. The second thing I want to illustrate, just to illustrate what this kind of means in terms of beyond nudge. So last week, Isabella Zeich presented her systematic review on counter radicalization. There was like an open question: what can we do to prevent radicalization? And one of the, thinking about how can we intervene and not just focus on those who have already been radicalized, because that's what lots of the attention gets put on. What about kind of more universal interventions to help reduce prejudice and discrimination? And one of the projects that BIT did a few years ago, which I'm very proud of my colleagues for doing, was pulling together a curriculum on social cohesion that was to be then be rolled out and taught in schools as part of their PSHE, which I can't remember what the acronym stands for. Personal Social Health Education, I think it stands for. And we pulled together, I didn't do it, like my colleagues did, pulled together several versions of a curriculum to be taught based on behavioral science that cover different things, like growth mindsets, empathy and perspective taking and so forth. And basically then ran a very large experiment, I think with about 20,000 kids, to see if this thing was effective. The results I don't think are public yet, so I won't talk about the results, but what's interesting to me, as far as I'm aware, it's the first time that something like this has been tested out in schools, and I think that to me was a revelation. Like, yeah, you can do this stuff quickly, you can do it at scale, and you can start to test out these ideas. And this is the sort of thing that might form the basis for other kinds of work to help reduce intergroup conflict and so forth. So I just wanted to point this out as an example of how behavioral science in practice, what it looks like and what it means, what it actually means in the real world. Okay. Before I finish up, I'm not talking about bodybuilders. No, I don't. I'm talking about effect sizes. So I've talked a lot about quite small differences. And one criticism of nudges is that the effects are quite small. And that's true. As I say on the screen, the difference is that they tend to stand up. And the evidence for that claim is that there's a piece of work done by De La Vigne and Linos that compared results for nudge studies, largely focused on tax compliance, published in academic journals and those reported on or completed by 2 US nudge units, including BIT. They found that in papers published in academic journals, the average impact of a nudge was very large, an 8.7 percentage point take-up increase over control. In the nudge unit trials, the average impact was still sizable and significant, but much smaller at 1.4 percentage points. And what they do is they go on to show, to try and explain this difference between the academic published literature and the kind of grey literature of the nudge units. And they found that a large share of the gap was accounted for by publication bias and is exacerbated by low statistical power in the sample of academic published papers. In contrast, nudge unit studies were well powered, and what it really comes down to is a huge difference in sample sizes. So the nudge unit study, they covered 23 million participants, and in the academic papers, they covered 500,000. So there's a gigantic difference in terms of the sample sizes. So I think, to me, this is a really good kind of sense check on what we should expect to see in terms of differences and how reliable, what kinds of size of study we need to be making claims about the reliability of a particular finding. But I also want to add in that we can get a perspective on how much of an impact we might have on crime as well. So on the right-hand side, there's a graph from the ONS, and it's comparing police-recorded crime in 2019-2020 versus 2020-2021. So total, this is a quote, total recorded crime saw substantial fall during April 2020 compared to April 2019, 26% decrease, coinciding with the introduction of the first national lockdown. So in perhaps the most all-encompassing crime prevention initiative ever introduced anywhere, making everyone stay indoors for weeks on end that cost £1 billion a day, we only saw a 26% drop in crime. So I think as a way of what should we expect to see, I think that to me is like the benchmark for how big an effect we can have with almost unlimited resources and quite a high level of compliance at population level. So I also think it makes the point to me that we should be much more willing to try out cheaper, faster alternatives, test them fast, fail them fast, and then keep on trying. Okay, I will click on quickly. What do we need to scale? I did mention this in my abstract. So I think we need three things: demonstration projects that show what can be done with justice departments or organizations involved, not just by external experts. So with these partner organizations, the Institute of Criminology has been leading the way in that for decades now. Second D is we need to democratize experimentation. So within the justice system, make it easy for experiments to happen. At the moment, it's not very easy. You need lots of expertise, lots of time. And the Cambridge Randomizer, again, is a great example of that. Something that I think can and should be used much more. And the third D is develop pipelines for testing. So we need to have things to test. And if you're thinking about how to test it, and that's something that I don't think is really thought through as much, and isn't really a priority at the moment. It tends to be a new policy comes through, let's try and test it. And yeah, I'll finish up by saying I think that behavioral science can help us and help you. There are lots of things I haven't talked about, of course. So how this stuff might contribute to, say, theory development or designing systems or design better interventions. At the very least, I hope I'll give you some idea of behavioral science being applied and the impact it can have, particularly in justice. And hopefully, if nothing else, there is some food for thought. And I will stop there. There you go.
Thank you, Alex. That was really interesting and inspiring. And clearly, you guys do a lot of experiments and a lot of work that's really not just interesting and exciting from an academic perspective, but it's also practical. There's a useful sort of findings that you can then translate into policy. So it's not just about the theory of crime or theories why things are working a certain way, but it's also a demonstration of how evidence-based policy actually is a very useful sort of target for us academics to think about. Whilst you're presenting, I thought about a few points that perhaps you want to comment on some of them, or already alluded to some of them before. One of them, and we ended the presentation with that, and that's a small effect size. And at the end of the day, the effect sizes that you present are not dramatic. In some examples you have, and obviously these are the ones that get published in Science. But in many cases, the ones that we see and get reports on get a small percentage point between the treatment group and the comparison group. It kind of makes you wonder, is it all worthwhile? So on the one hand, you can say, yes, of course, the ones that are very cheap, but changing the letter, that actually makes a lot of sense. And why not? If it's a very small percentage point, then you can invest in this area because it really doesn't cost you any money. But if you're thinking about it, just having a new letter, letters are expensive. If you're thinking about an effect size at the end of it, it's not dramatic. And on the other side of things, when you're trying to change behavior in an impressive sort of way, for example, taking offenders, taking organized crime group offenders, violent offenders, you're up against not just a nudge, you're up against a lifestyle choice, a thing that's very lucrative. I mean, some of these gang members make thousands of dollars a pound every day. And then we want to think about how we can nudge them or use behavioral sciences into changing their behavior. And it seems to me it's a really hard task. Now, it's not completely impossible, but the point to think about, and you ended with this, and I think it's savvy to think about it this way, don't expect behavioral insights or nudges to change the world dramatically unless it's something in an add-on sort of way that multiple nudges and multiple behavioral insights sort of approaches change the way that we behave. So that's one general point. Another point is, I guess, the thinking about desensitization, about, are we getting to a point where everybody's aware of these little tricks? And then they kind of, of course, it's one of those nudges. Of course, that's what they need. On top of the list, yeah, everybody gets that. It's not just for me. So are we getting to a point where everybody's just aware of all these little sort of tricks to change and modify our behavior, and then it will stop working? So I know it's very speculative, and I know you very much about evidence, not just about speculation, but I think it's something to think about. Another area, which I guess is a call for all of us, is to think about other populations where this might be helpful. So you think about the general public, which is great. and you gave some examples about offenders. But I'm thinking, how can we prevent victimization? And specifically about cyber fraud. And I think it's a ripe area of research and practice because almost know the rules. You don't give your password, look at the right sort of standards of when a website is real or not, but we keep on failing at this, again and again and again. So how is it that we can protect ourselves from all these potential sort of pitfalls in life and becoming victims, especially in the cyber world? And I think it's a ripe area for crime. The final, I guess it's a little bit critical about publication generally, not just about this. Some of the papers that come out on behavioral insights, sort of like nudges and so on, they report, for example, a non-statistically significant difference between treatment and control. And they're very difficult to interpret. Is it the case that the study wasn't good from a methodological perspective, or is it because the treatment in reality, if there's such a word in science, doesn't work? It's very tricky to know. Am I reading a paper about something that actually doesn't work? I know I'm not allowed to use the word actual, but nevertheless, actually doesn't work, or time is flawed. So I'm just wondering what your take is on publications more broadly, whether these kind of studies should have more of a caveat about, we're not really sure about the methodology or about the outcome. One example that you pointed out to is about sending nudges or text messages to people who appear before court. There were a couple of experiments that we conducted here in the UK, but the conclusion was that there's no difference between treatment and control, but then we found out that actually half the text messages weren't sent out because the numbers were incorrect. But that's another problem with the net, maybe you can fix it, but they don't record the phone numbers properly, so that when we send out messages, they actually don't get to the address, to the person that's supposed to get it.
Hampshire, not the.
I was actually talking about the Met because the Met tried to do an experiment as such to send out messages to people who appear before court, and another one for victims of domestic abuse. And it turns out they don't record not the phone number nor the address of the offenders. So that it's recorded, so maybe I shouldn't say this. But the point is, too late. But the point is that should we put a caveat on publications about the conclusion whether the problem with the theory and the finding from a conceptual policy point or about the methodology? Without a stop.